Hello everyone. In this video lecture, I'm going to go over some background information and plot summary that will help you to better understand the events of this novel that we're going to be spending the next 4 weeks studying, Jessica Grant's Come Thou Tortoise. As you've no doubt already seen from your attempts to begin to read the novel, there are a number of strange elements in the text. Certain eccentricities of the prose style, that is, the style of writing, that make the story difficult to understand. It's also presented to us in a non chronological order. In other words, we jump back and forth between different time periods and different narrators inside the story. And events are related to us about Audrey's past, her childhood, her contemporary state, her relationship with a former boyfriend, in a fashion that is jumbled up or confused. Oftentimes, these transitions between time periods are not actually signaled. They're still in the same tense, and they're still dealing with the same narrator who has the same voice. However, at times, even though the narrator sounds like the same person, she's a child dealing with a visit from her grandmother, for instance. And in the next chapter, without any indication of a shift in narrative voice, she's the adult, 24 to 30-year-old or 28-year-old woman who's dealing with the death of her father. So you have to pay very careful attention as you're reading to see not only what's going on, but also when it's going on. What time period are we in the novel? And we'll talk about some of the things that will allow you to better understand this disjointed and disoriented plot as we go through this video lecture. This novel was written in 2009, and it was the first piece produced by Jessica Grant, an author of contemporary Canadian literature. As you may have noticed, the prose style is not straightforward. It is rife with puns, misspellings, deliberate misrepresentations. There are small drawings posted in the margins, composed by the narrator herself, supposedly. So it can be quite confusing. There are also no quotation marks, so the dialogue blends directly into the descriptions of events and scenes. So the world is almost indistinguishable from other characters' dialogue. They just get jumbled up together. There are innumerable misspellings within the text that are intentional, that are meaningful. So sometimes homonyms are used. And although the work has a kind of superficial veneer of comedy and humor because of all this wordplay, there is also a deep undercurrent of grief and loss that we'll be exploring through the text. You've no doubt heard of somebody who laughs to keep from crying, or who uses humor to cover the pain. In a way, this story, on the level of its narration, is doing the same thing. The wordplay, the puns, the games, and the jokes that are suffused throughout the work are in fact a veneer, a covering to plaster over all the pain and grief and loss that the main character and the narrator is trying to deny. So humor becomes a kind of defense mechanism against grief, a way of denying the grief and pain and loss that are roiling under the surface of her experience. She's trying to distance herself from that pain by applying this humorous veneer. So our experience of the novel is a parallel to the narrator's experience of her own loss, the loss of her father. The title here, Come Thou Tortoise, is a quotation from Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Now, The Tempest is a fantastical, magical play, the last of Shakespeare's career, wherein Shakespeare metatextually looks back at his own experiences as an author or a playwright. Now, metatextual just means that the work of fiction is aware of itself as fiction. It makes us aware as an audience or as readers of the fact that it is artificial, that it's fake, it's actors on the stage. As an example, if you've seen either of the two Deadpool movies, there's a scene in the first Deadpool movie where Wade Wilson is going in to undergo this surgical procedure that will unlock his mutant healing ability and give him superpowers. And he says, as he's strapped down to the gurney, please, just no CGI green costume, or something to that effect. No green spandex. What he's referring to in that moment is, well, you might be familiar with it as breaking the fourth wall. He's referring back to the fact that Ryan Reynolds, the actor playing Wade Wilson, was once Green Lantern, and he was in this CGI green costume. That moment of breaking the fourth wall is a moment of meta, or metatextual commentary. The work is reminding us that we're not actually dealing with the person like a human being, Wade Wilson, the character. We're dealing with the actor. So the actor foregrounds himself as an actor in that moment, reminding us of the previous movies that he starred in, much to his chagrin, no doubt. The same thing happened at the end of the sort of post-credit sequence in Deadpool 2, where Deadpool shows up in Ryan Reynolds' office in the past and shoots him in the head before he can actually sign off on the script to Green Lantern. So in both of those moments, you have a moment of breaking the fourth wall, but it's also a metatextual moment where the actor and the character sort of blend together, and we're reminded that we're not looking at a person, the character, we're looking at the person, the actor. Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, is metatextual because the central character in this work, this magician who can control all the events on his island, Prospero, is in fact a proxy or an analog, a representation of Shakespeare himself. And as Prospero, this character inside the play, grows old and comes to terms with the reality and the necessity of his own death, he realizes that he has to let go of his family, let go of his hatred and his earthly concerns, because he has precious little time left. As he comes to terms with that reality, so too, in parallel, Shakespeare is coming to terms with the fact that he has to quit the stage. He has to give up this public life as somebody who is a publicly recognized figure and a playwright. This is his last work, his farewell to the stage. He is going to go into retirement, and shortly thereafter, he's going to die because he's getting too old. The character inside the work is, at numerous points within the play, paralleled with Shakespeare. Now, the title, and in fact the entire novella, Come Thou Tortoise, or the entire novel, Come Thou Tortoise, is very much indebted to Shakespeare's Tempest. We're not going to delve too deeply into those comparisons. Really, you would need to read Shakespeare's Tempest in order to appreciate all the parallels. I'll highlight a few as we go on. But for now, simply recognize that this work is very much in conversation with. It's referring back to, by way of its very title, the play, The Tempest, by Shakespeare. And in the same way that Prospero is coming to terms with the reality of his own death, so too is this novel an exploration of, well, coming to terms with death, working through grief associated with death, and understanding that process, expanding our sense of empathy in the context, for us, of a caring milieu. The title itself literally just means move faster, slowpoke. So come, like let's get going, you, Tortoise. In the play, it's just a throwaway line from Prospero as he orders one of his servants, Caliban, to move faster. You're dawdling, you're moving too slowly. So come, thou Tortoise. Get on with it. In a way, there is a double meaning in the context of this work. Audrey Flowers, the central character we'll be talking about in just a moment, is developmentally delayed. She has a low IQ, and as a result, she is, quote unquote, slow. She is slow to understand things. She's slow to piece together the mysteries. She's slow to understand the true nature of what's going on around her. So much of this novel is her trying to solve the mysteries around her and the confused muddle of her thoughts. Even though they're conveyed with wit and humor, levity, the confused muddle as she tries to work through the questions that she doesn't even know to ask and find the answers she doesn't know that she needs. This first overarching plot is about the adult Audrey, who is between the ages of 24 and 26. Audrey, at the start of the novel, is flying home to see her father, who has been hit by a car and is now in a coma. Now, her uncle, Uncle Toby, really has told her that there is no hope of her father's recovery, but Audrey is convinced in these first few chapters that he can be saved. She looks at these events and thinks that if she just reaches him, then there'll be this fantastical fairy tale conclusion and the father will be able to survive. However, he dies before she can actually return home. She's traveling from Oregon from Portland, Oregon, back to Newfoundland. During that trip, the father dies. Now, the novel, in this first plot, in like the present day, deals with her experience of that death, her relationships with the people around her as they try to support her through the loss of her father, and the ways she tries to distract herself from the central issues here. The first section of the novel deals primarily with her preparations for and execution of the father's funeral. However, interspersed with these moments of the overarching present day plot is a second plot that we jump back and forth to. This second plot is told by way of full chapter flashbacks, and it deals with Audrey when she is a child. It helps to establish the relationship between Audrey and Uncle Toby and her father when she was a young girl, and the other extended family members and friends, her grandmother and Toff, a gentleman that she meets and does not care for. So we see in the present day, she's dealing with all these people as she grapples with the loss of her father, and then we get background information about their relationships when she was a child through these flashback chapters. These flashback chapters of Audrey as a child start out with Audrey and her father engaging with each other, living alone. Eventually, however, Uncle Toby comes to live with them. And it's only after a series of false starts. In other words, Walter Flowers and Audrey go to the airport several times expecting Uncle Toby to arrive, but he doesn't. He keeps on delaying or not coming on the flights that he's scheduled to travel upon. Through this section of the novel, we have a growing relationship between Audrey and Uncle Toby as she comes to recognize that Uncle Toby is not actually a threat. He's not going to sort of take the father's love away from her. He's not going to distract the father from her, that they can now work and become a kind of family with Uncle Toby living with them. They also have some visits with Toff and the grandmother. So Toff is an old friend of Audrey's father, and her grandmother come to visit at one point. Their arrival seems to drive Uncle Toby from the home for some reason, so they don't seem to care for Walter's brother. A few notes about the difficulties and challenges of this text. As I said, there are no quotation marks, so you're going to have to be very careful looking for dialogue tags like he said or how characters respond within the narration. Look for paragraph breaks as well to see when dialogue breaks from description. In this case, the author has chosen to do so, or to structure the text in this way, potentially as a way of conveying Audrey's inability to distinguish between people and circumstances, her inability to create a boundary between her thoughts and the dialogue and discourse of other people. It's a way of showing how influenced she is by the presumptions, beliefs, and words of other characters as they shape and define her thoughts. Her very narration is indistinguishable from, her thoughts are indistinguishable from the language of other people. And we'll see how that plays out potentially in some examples from the story as we go on. There's frequent use of wordplay and deliberate grammatical errors, so do not take this story as an example of good writing in the sense that it is grammatically correct, because it's not. There are sentence fragments all over the place, incomplete thoughts, and more. The narrator is totally unreliable. There are mysteries and incidents within the story that she simply does not understand. There are innumerable questions that we ask that she does not. And there are innumerable answers that we want to try to find to questions that we ask that she is utterly incapable of understanding. So the boundaries between us and the narrator are extreme. The irony between us and the narrator are extreme, in that because of her childish perspective, because of her low IQ, she can't even understand what's going on, let alone convey it to us. So it's incumbent upon us. We are responsible for examining the text very carefully in a considered fashion to see or to read between the lines of what's going on, to try to understand what other characters are actually thinking and doing. Audrey's perception, her judgments of characters cannot be trusted. Their natures, their responsibilities, their inclinations, their desires, their motivations. All of these things are conveyed to us. They're stated to us directly by Audrey, but we can't believe Audrey because she's constantly failing to understand what's going on and misrepresenting events. So we're responsible for examining the text and looking underneath the surface of what she has to say to understand what really goes on. It is also, as I said, a non-linear narrative. The two stories themselves are linear for the most part. We're going straight through, but we're jumping back and forth without any signals between the adult Audrey and the child Audrey. So, as you're reading, stop at the beginning of each chapter and remind yourself that I need to make sure that I know who is speaking at this moment, which of the two narrators we're dealing with, and when. What point in the story is being narrated to us? Is this our first narrator, Audrey, dealing with the present, or is she dealing with the past? I need to be careful of looking at the text and seeing what we're dealing with in this chapter. And if it's even Audrey at all. In other words, is it Audrey, the human narrator of the story, or is it Winifred, the tortoise narrator of the story? And that's what we'll talk about just now, the second narrator. In this story, as I said, we have two narrators. Audrey Flowers, the low IQ primary narrator who is returning home to try to visit her father before he passes away and fails. And then the second narrator, a tortoise, the pet tortoise that is owned by Audrey. What we have here, in the fact that a tortoise is capable of narrating to us, is an example of the literary genre of magical realism. So just as you can have like horror literature or realistic fiction like Charles Dickens, as he's describing real world events and characters, people living the lives that we can understand, fantasy or science fiction as genres, we also have magic realism as a kind of genre. In magic realism, you have realism. That is, characters behave rationally, the world operates according to the laws of nature as we understand them. There are no fanciful technologies, there are no witches or wizards, save for one violation, one strange occurrence or set of occurrences that operate confined to one single area of the story. For example, in Midnight's Children by Solomon Rushdie, you have a group of children who are born at midnight on the eve of Indian independence who gain some kind of superpower. For instance, one of them has a tremendously enhanced sense of smell. This person is able to detect minute variations in scent and track people like a human bloodhound. These superpowers are the one odd thing in the universe, and nobody treats them as being odd. They're just accepted as being, well, something that's realistic. It's just something that happens. So magic realism adds in one core aspect of the story that violates or overturns realism as we understand it. Here, it's the tortoise narrator. Now, none of the characters actually know that Winifred, the tortoise narrator pet of Audrey, is actually capable of thought, of sapience. However, she delivers about a quarter of the narration in the story. So as you're reading along, make sure that you are being conscious of when the narrator shifts over to this second narrator. So in this first video, we've talked about some of the difficulties surrounding this text and the overarching plot. The next video lecture is going to delve into some spoilers about the nature of the characters. Remember that I mentioned in this video that Audrey misunderstands almost everything around her, and actually continues to do so right into the end of the novel. She places clues throughout the work based on her failures of understanding and starts to gather the clues around her to try to understand what's going on, but she fails. It's up to us to take her clues and the narrative's clues and aggregate them together to understand what's actually going on by the end of the work. Because we're not reading the entire story, and because I want you to have as easy a time as possible to understand the work as a whole, I'm going to do part of that work for you. I'm going to spoil the revelations, what the clues actually amount to, what they lead to, so that you can understand what's really going on behind the scenes in each of these incidents that Audrey goes through. So in the next video, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be talking about what we're presented with at the beginning of the novel in terms of characters and their relationships, and what is actually going on behind the surface that allows everything to come into focus and allows us to better understand the events that didn't make sense leading up to the conclusion of the novel. We'll talk about that in the next video lecture.